The arena was silent. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room. This was the held-breath silence of 40,000 aliens watching something impossible happen. The Galactic Sovereignty's Grand Champion lay flat on the stone floor of the Imperial Combat Circle. His name was Draven. He stood 9 feet tall when standing. His scales were reinforced with natural bone plating that had stopped plasma rounds before. 300 victories carved into his record like scars. He had fallen in 1 round. The creature who knocked him down was not a god. Not a legendary warrior from some ancient bloodline. Not even a ranked fighter. It was a human. The human stood in the center of the circle, chest rising and falling slowly. He had no armor. No energy weapon. No enhancement implants visible on his skin. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with a torn sleeve and a name tag that read Paul from Sector 7 Maintenance Bay. His hands were loose at his sides. His expression was calm. Not proud. Not angry. Just calm. Queen Vara stood in the royal observation box above the arena. Her silver crown caught the light. Her 4 advisors were frozen beside her. Her general had his hand over his mouth. She stared down at the human nobody from Sector 7. And for the first time in her reign, she had no words. The Galactic Sovereignty was not a small empire. It stretched across 11 star systems and governed over 200 alien species. It had standing armies, orbital defense platforms, trade agreements with every major power in the known galaxy, and a queen who had ruled it all since age 19 with a steadiness that made her enemies nervous and her allies grateful. Queen Vara was not cruel. But she was precise. She believed in order, in hierarchy, in the idea that every being had a place and that stability came from respecting those places. Humans were new to the sovereignty. They had been absorbed into the empire 6 years ago after the Compact of New Cordova, a peace agreement that ended a border conflict before it became a war. Humans were granted secondary citizen status, which meant they could live and work within sovereignty space but could not hold military rank, vote in imperial councils, or enter the upper residential districts of any sovereign station. Most humans accepted this quietly. They worked in maintenance bays, cargo docks, agricultural sectors, and support roles. They were not mistreated exactly. They were simply not considered significant. Paul had been on Sovereign Station Kale for 2 years. He was 26 years old, average height by human standards, with dark eyes and the kind of quiet face that people looked past without meaning to. He fixed atmospheric processors in Sector 7. He ate in the secondary cafeteria. He slept in a bunk that was slightly too short for him. He had never caused problems. He had never asked for more than he was given. He was, by every measure the sovereignty used to evaluate a being's importance, completely unremarkable. The Imperial Games were held every 3 years. They were not simply entertainment. They were political theater wrapped in ritual. Every major species in the sovereignty sent champions to compete in the combat circle. The Queen presided. Alliances were announced. Trade terms were influenced by outcomes. The species whose champion won earned symbolic favor with the crown for the cycle ahead. This cycle, the favorite was Draven of the Korath. The Korath were the sovereignty's oldest military ally. They were large, fast, and engineered by centuries of warrior culture to be physically exceptional. Draven had won the last 2 grand championships. He was expected to win a third. The lesser matches happened first. Smaller species sent fighters who competed in earlier rounds for minor honors. Most were over quickly. Paul was not scheduled to compete. He had not entered the games. He had a maintenance shift that morning. He was supposed to be replacing a coolant relay on level 4 when the announcement came through the station intercom that the Pelori fighter had collapsed in the preparation chamber from a sudden respiratory failure and that the match slot was now open. Station policy allowed any secondary citizen to volunteer as a replacement in exhibition matches. Exhibition matches did not count for political points. They were filler. They kept the schedule running. Paul had volunteered. Not out of ambition. He mentioned later, to the one person who asked, that he had simply finished his shift early and had nothing else to do that afternoon. Nobody noticed him walk into the preparation chamber. The chamber staff gave him the standard form and a pair of combat sandals when he said his boots were steel-toed and might be considered a weapon. They asked if he wanted protective gear. He asked what was available. They showed him a basic padded vest. He put it on, decided it was uncomfortable, and handed it back. The staff member who processed him was a young Pelori named Fon, who later told everyone she thought the human had simply misunderstood the process and would leave once he realized what an exhibition match actually involved. He did not leave. He waited in the corridor outside the arena with the calm patience of someone waiting for a transport. He stretched his arms. He rolled his shoulders. He sat on a bench and looked at the ceiling for a while. When the arena doors opened and the announcer called for the exhibition competitor, Paul stood up and walked out into 40,000 sets of alien eyes without hesitation. The crowd reaction was light laughter. Not unkind exactly. Just the low amusement of beings who found the situation mildly absurd. A human. In a maintenance uniform. Walking into the combat circle as though he belonged there. His opponent was a mid-rank Koroth warrior named Breck. Not Draven. Not a champion. But still Koroth. Still significantly larger and trained from childhood. Breck looked at Paul the way someone looks at a small unexpected insect on an otherwise clean floor. The match lasted 40 seconds. Breck moved first, which was customary. He was fast for his size. He closed the distance in 3 steps and threw a strike that would have ended most opponents before they processed it was coming. Paul moved sideways. Not backward. Sideways. The strike missed by a precise margin that looked almost deliberate. What happened next was difficult to explain to people who had not seen it. Paul did not punch or kick in any conventional sense. He redirected. He used Breck's forward momentum, added one precise point of contact at the Koroth warrior's shoulder joint, and the large alien completed a full rotation through the air before landing hard on the stone floor. Breck did not get up. The crowd was confused. A few aliens near the front stood to see better. Some checked if the floor was somehow sloped. The announcer said nothing for 4 full seconds. Paul stood in the center of the circle. He looked at Breck once to confirm the Koroth warrior was breathing and unhurt beyond his pride. Then he looked up at the crowd with that same unremarkable calm. The announcer recovered and called the result. Exhibition winner, secondary citizen Paul, Sector 7 maintenance. There was scattered applause. Mostly bewilderment. And somewhere above it all, in the royal observation box, Queen Vara watched with an expression her advisors had never seen before. Then Draven stepped forward and requested a formal match. The request was unprecedented. Grand champions did not challenge exhibition fighters. It was beneath their station, beneath the dignity of the games, and frankly outside any rule the Games Commission had needed to write before because no one had imagined the situation would arise. Draven did not care about precedent. He had watched Paul's match from the champion's corridor and felt something he had not felt in years. Not fear exactly. But something adjacent to it, something that made his instincts push forward rather than pull back. Warriors of his experience knew that feeling. It meant something worth paying attention to was in the room. He submitted the formal request through the commission to Queen Vara's box. She could reject it. That would be the easy choice. She approved it in under a minute. Her advisor Rila, a tall Veth female who had counseled 3 queens before Vara, leaned close and asked quietly what the queen expected to happen. Vara said she expected to learn something. The crowd's confusion shifted into genuine anticipation when the announcement came. Some aliens laughed, assuming this was ceremonial. Others were quiet in the way that comes before something real. The political observers in the upper seats began making notes. Paul was still standing in the circle when the announcement was made. The commission official walked out to inform him of the challenge. Paul listened. Asked one question. The official confirmed. Yes, this was voluntary. He could decline. Paul looked toward the champion's corridor where Draven was emerging into the light. He nodded and stayed where he was. Draven was everything Paul was not, at least by appearance. Massive. Armored by nature. Moving with the controlled power of a being who had spent his entire life training to be the most dangerous thing in any room. The crowd rose when he entered. The cheers were automatic, reflexive, the way people cheer for something that has already earned their certainty. Paul watched him approach and did not move his feet. Rila watched from the box and noted in her private record that the human showed no physiological stress signals that she could read. No trembling. No backing away. No performance of bravado either. He simply stood there the way a wall stands. Present. Unannounced. The match rules were confirmed. Standard combat circle. No weapons. Victory by incapacitation or yield. No time limit. The crowd went silent again as the signal sounded. Draven came forward with the precision of a military unit. He had studied his opponents for 20 years. He read Paul in 3 seconds and determined the human would likely attempt the same redirect technique. He planned for it. What he had not planned for was the fact that Paul had also read him in 3 seconds. The exchange was brief. To spectators farther back it looked almost like the two fighters simply passed each other. What actually happened was a sequence of contact points so precisely placed and timed that Draven's own structure worked against him. His strength became the problem. His momentum became the lever. He hit the floor the way large things fall. Completely. All at once. He did not get up. The silence lasted longer this time. 11 seconds, Rila counted later from the recording. 11 seconds of 40,000 beings processing what they had just seen. Then the sound came. Not cheers exactly. A kind of collective noise that had no clean name, something between shock and involuntary recognition, the sound a crowd makes when reality does something it was not supposed to do. Paul stood in the center of the circle, not triumphant, not posturing, just standing. He looked down at Draven once. Then he looked up at the royal box. He did not bow. He did not know the custom. He simply looked up and met the Queen's eyes across the distance of the arena as though he wanted to confirm something and had found it. Queen Vara held his gaze. Her general, Voss, was already moving behind her, speaking in low quick tones to his aide. The Koroth diplomatic envoy in the adjacent box was very still. The commission was in quiet crisis. None of the game's documentation covered this outcome. Vara raised her hand and the crowd sound dropped instantly. She had that quality, the ability to make silence simply by reaching for it. She addressed the arena without amplification because the station's acoustic design carried her voice perfectly when she chose to stand straight. She said, "Bring the human to the court." Not as a command with threat behind it. As an announcement with weight. As a queen who had decided something and was now letting the decision exist in the world. Paul was escorted from the circle by 4 royal guards who were uncertain how formally to handle him. The walk from the arena to the royal court took 9 minutes. Paul walked in the middle of the 4 guards without being told to. He did not speak. He looked at the station architecture as they moved through it, the vaulted ceilings with light filters that mimicked natural sky, the floor materials that shifted from stone to composite as they entered the government sector, the way the air temperature changed precisely at the line where the secondary corridors met the royal wing. He had cleaned the atmospheric processors that regulated this exact wing for 2 years. He had never walked through it as anything other than a maintenance worker. One of the guards, a young Veth soldier named Kale, kept glancing at Paul sideways. He finally said, quietly, that he had watched the match from the corridor. Paul said thank you. Kale said he did not understand what he had watched. Paul said that was all right. He did not fully understand it himself in a way he could explain quickly. Kale seemed to want to ask more, but the corridor opened into the court antechamber and they all stopped speaking. The court was already assembled. Not the full ceremonial court, this was faster than that, but enough. 20 senior advisors. 3 military officers. The Korath envoy who had arrived ahead of them with an expression that suggested controlled anger. 2 of the Queen's personal guard flanking the throne platform. And Vara herself, seated now, crown straight, hands folded, watching the door when Paul entered. He stopped where the guards indicated. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, "Who are you, Paul of Sector 7? It was not a simple question. Not the way she asked it. She was not requesting his file. She was not asking for rank or species designation. She was asking something underneath those things, something that had been building since the moment Draven hit the floor. Paul was quiet for a moment. Not nervous. Thinking. He said he was a maintenance worker. That he had grown up in a small coastal city on Earth. That he had trained in a human discipline called judo from age 8 because his father had trained in it, and his father before that. That he had never competed professionally. That he had volunteered for the exhibition match because he had finished his shift and the slot was open. The Korath envoy, who had been silent until now, spoke sharply. He said this was an insult to the Grand Games. That Draven had been manipulated somehow. That a maintenance human could not defeat a Korath champion in a legitimate match. Paul looked at the envoy. He said nothing. Vara said, also to the envoy, "I watched the match." "You watched the match. We both know what legitimate looks like." The envoy subsided. Barely. Rila, standing at Vara's right, leaned close and said something too quiet for the room to hear. Vara listened. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. She looked back at Paul. She told him he would remain on this station for a period of review. That his maintenance contract would be suspended with full pay. That he was to be given quarters in the transition wing, not the secondary sector. She said, "I have more questions. And I find that rare." Paul said, "I'll answer what I can." The transition wing was not the royal quarter, but it was not Sector 7 either. Paul's new room had a window that looked out at real stars. His previous bunk had faced a ventilation panel. He sat on the edge of the actual bed for a while that first night and looked at the stars and thought about his father, who had taught him that the most important thing a person could do in a new room was breathe slowly and take it one corner at a time. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like himself, just in a different place. In the morning, Rila came to speak with him personally. She was formal but not cold. She brought 2 cups of something warm and set one in front of him without asking if he wanted it. He drank it. It tasted like dark tea with something slightly metallic underneath. He drank it anyway. She told him the political situation around his victory was more complicated than it might appear. The Korath were the sovereignty's most powerful military ally. Draven's defeat was being discussed in ways that went beyond sport. Some on the council felt it needed to be contained or explained away. Others, a smaller group, thought it should be studied. Paul asked which group the Queen was in. Rila looked at him for a moment. Then she said Vara was in neither group. Vara wanted to understand the reality of what happened, not manage the perception of it. Paul said that sounded right, from what he had seen of her. Rila said it was the first accurate observation a human had made about the Queen in 6 years. Over the following days, Vara summoned Paul to the court 3 times. Not for formal proceedings. Smaller meetings, in the side chamber off the main hall, with only Rila present and sometimes Kale standing guard by the door. The Queen asked questions and Paul answered them. He asked questions back, which surprised her the first time and seemed to interest her the second. He asked about the political structure of the sovereignty. About how decisions were made. About what secondary citizenship actually meant to the people inside the system, not in the legal definition but in the daily reality. She answered carefully but fully. She was not performing for him. She was thinking alongside him, which was something Rila noted and filed away as significant. Paul told her about Earth. About the specific harbor city where he had grown up. About training in a small gym that smelled like rubber mats and his father's coffee. About how judo was not about being stronger. It was about understanding force. Understanding where a thing's weight was going and choosing to help it go there faster. Vara listened to that last part twice. She asked him to repeat the principle. He said it again. Understanding where a thing's weight is going and helping it go there faster. She was quiet after that. Not dismissively quiet. Thoughtfully quiet, the kind that means something is being placed carefully into a larger structure in someone's mind. She said it sounded like governance as much as combat. Paul said he had never thought of it that way, but she was probably right. The trouble came from Voss. General Voss had commanded the sovereignty's military forces for 12 years. He was not a bad man. He was a careful one. He had built his career on knowing exactly where risks lived and keeping them at a measured distance. Paul was a risk he had not measured. Voss requested a private audience with Vara and argued that the human's presence in the transition wing, his access to the Queen, and the growing attention from other species in the court, was a destabilizing factor. The Karath were already tense. 3 other allied species had sent quiet inquiries about the game's outcome. Giving Paul a visible position of favor would signal something the sovereignty was not ready to back up. Vara listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked Voss what he was actually afraid of. Voss said he was not afraid. He was being strategic. Vara said strategy and fear wore the same armor sometimes. She asked again what he was actually afraid of. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he was afraid the court would see her taking the human seriously and conclude she was either naive or weakening. Vara stood. She said, "Or they will conclude that I have found something worth taking seriously. Those are different conclusions and I know which one is true." Voss left the audience with the rigid posture of a man who had lost an argument but had not yet decided to accept it. Paul knew none of this until Rila told him 2 days later. He listened, then said he was sorry to be causing difficulty. Rila said he was not causing it. He was simply making it visible. That was actually more useful. On the 8th day, Paul asked if he could return to Sector 7 for a shift. Rila looked at him as though he had said something in a language she did not speak. He explained that his atmospheric processor project was at a critical stage and that his colleague, a Pelori named Fun, had been covering his assignments alone. He said Fun was competent but the Section 4 relay had a pressure irregularity that needed specific calibration and he did not want to leave it to chance. Rila went to Vara. Vara said yes, and then asked to come. This was the moment Rila later described to the younger court staff when they asked about the Queen's decision. She had expected the request to go through channels, to generate a security discussion, to be modified and formalized. Instead Vara simply asked to come, the way a person asks to join a walk. They went to Sector 7. Paul in his maintenance clothes, Vara in a plain long coat that covered her crown, 2 guards in unmarked uniforms. Fun nearly dropped her calibration tool when she recognized who had walked into the maintenance bay. Paul introduced them. Vara shook Fun's hand in the human custom because Paul had once mentioned it and she had remembered. Paul worked. Vara watched. She asked questions about the processor systems, about how the atmospheric regulation affected different species populations in different sectors, about how Paul had learned the specific calibration technique he was using. They were in Sector 7 for 2 hours. On the walk back, Vara was quiet in that thoughtful way. Then she said she had governed this station for 6 years and had never been in Sector 7 before. Paul said a lot of good things happened in Sector 7. She said she was beginning to understand that. The Korath envoy escalated. He submitted a formal diplomatic grievance to the Sovereignty Council, arguing that Draven's defeat had been achieved through deception, specifically that Paul's enrollment in the games had bypassed standard qualification channels and therefore the result should be nullified. The grievance required a formal council response. Vara convened the senior council in the main hall and the session was attended by representatives of 7 allied species, all of them watching to see how the Queen would handle the pressure. Paul was not invited to the session. He was not a citizen with council access. He sat in the transition wing and waited. The session lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Rila came to find him. She sat down across from him and said the council had voted to offer the Korath a goodwill gesture, specifically a formal apology from the Crown acknowledging that the qualification process had been irregular. Paul said that seemed fair. He had technically entered through a non-standard process. Rila said the apology would also include a statement that the match result was unofficial and that Draven's record would not be formally impacted. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. Rila watched him. She said the Queen had voted against the goodwill gesture. That she had been the single opposing vote on the council. Paul looked up. Rila said Vara had stated publicly, in the full council, that a result witnessed by 40,000 beings and recorded on every feed in the station could not be made unofficial by political preference. She said that calling a true thing untrue was not goodwill. It was the beginning of bad governance. The council had overruled her 4 votes to 1. Paul said he was sorry the Queen had been put in that position. Rila said the Queen had not seemed sorry at all. That night, Vara came to the transition wing herself. No guards. Just Rila at the far end of the corridor as a formality. She knocked on Paul's door, which was something Queens apparently did not do, and when he opened it she asked if she could come in. He stepped back. She sat in the chair by the window that looked out at the stars. She told him about the council vote. He said Rila had already told him. She said she had expected that. She was quiet for a moment and then she said she wanted to explain something. She said she had not voted against the gesture because of him specifically. She had voted against it because the sovereignty had a pattern she had been watching for 3 years, a tendency to smooth things over in ways that felt like peace but were actually the slow compression of truth under political weight. Each compromise made the next one easier. She was afraid of where that road ended. Paul said he understood that concern. He said it reminded him of something his father told him about training partners who were too gentle. He said if someone always lets you win gently, you never find out what you are actually capable of. Vara looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is the most honest thing anyone in this court has said to me in 2 years." He said he was not trying to be wise. He was just talking. She said those 2 things were not always different. She stayed for another hour. They talked about the station. About her sister who lived on a planetary colony and had never wanted politics. About Paul's mother who had made him read books about human history before he was allowed to watch anything on screen. When she left, she paused at the door and said his formal status would be reviewed in the morning. He said he hoped the atmospheric relays in Sector 7 would not be affected. She smiled. It was a small smile but it was entirely real. The formal review changed his designation to Provisional Allied Civilian, a category that had existed in sovereignty law but had never been used. It was not full citizenship. It was something between the lines. But it came with court access rights, which meant Paul could attend open sessions and move through government corridors without an escort. Voss had objected again and Vara had, for once, worked around him rather than through him. Paul used the access quietly. He did not attend council sessions to insert himself. He watched. He learned how decisions moved through the sovereignty structure. He asked Rila questions when she had time, and she began making time because she found the questions useful to answer, the kind of questions that made you think about what you already knew from a slightly different angle. The Korath situation was not resolved. The diplomatic grievance remained open. The envoy had returned to Korath space and the official channels were technically still active but practically stalled. The Korath response to the Queen's Council vote had been cold. Their next scheduled trade review was delayed without explanation. Some in court blamed Paul simply for existing. He was the visible center of the problem. Voss had allies on the council who made sure that point circulated quietly. Paul was aware of it. He was not bothered by it exactly, but he thought about it. He thought about what Vara had said about truth under political weight. He thought about his father's advice about new rooms: breathe slowly, take it one corner at a time. One evening Cale, who had become something close to a companion in a quiet way, asked Paul if he was afraid of what might happen. Paul said he did not know what was going to happen, so he could not be afraid of it specifically. He said he was more careful than afraid. Careful was useful. Fear without information was just noise. Cale said he was going to think about that for a while. Paul said that was fine. He was still thinking about it himself. The Korath sent an ultimatum. It arrived through official diplomatic channels on a morning when the station's secondary sectors were still in their night cycle and the government wing had only skeleton staff. Rila received it first and woke Vara within the hour. The ultimatum had 3 points. The first was that the sovereignty formally nullify the match result and issue a public statement that Draven's record remained unbroken. The second was that the human designated as Paul be removed from provisional allied civilian status and returned to secondary designation with restrictions. The third was that if these conditions were not met within 72 hours, the Korath would withdraw from the Sovereignty Alliance, which meant their military contributions, their trade routes through Korath space, and their political support in intersystem councils would all go with them. This was not a small threat. The council convened an emergency session within 3 hours. The hall was fuller than usual. The energy in it was the specific kind that came from powerful people feeling afraid and expressing it as decisiveness. Speaker after speaker made the same argument with different words. The Korath alliance was load-bearing. The sovereignty could not afford to lose it over a games match and one human maintenance worker. The practical path was clear. Vara sat at the head of the table and listened to each of them. When they finished, she said she needed 1 hour before she responded. The council agreed, expecting her to use the hour to compose a formal acceptance of the Korath terms. She used the hour to find Paul. He was in the observation corridor near the station's upper ring, the long curved hallway with full glass facing open space. He went there sometimes in the early morning when the corridor was empty. He was looking at a cluster of stars that he had identified as being roughly in the direction of Earth. Vara came and stood beside him. She told him about the ultimatum. All 3 points. She did not soften it or translate it. She told him exactly what the Korath had asked for. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" She said she had not decided. She said she had come to hear from him first. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't nullify the match on my account. I mean that. Whatever you decide about the alliance and the politics and the strategy, don't change what was true because of me." She asked what about the restriction of his status. He said he was a maintenance worker from Sector 7. Whatever designation he carried made no difference to the atmospheric processors. She said that was not what she asked. He turned and looked at her directly. He said, "I think you already know what the right decision is. I think that's why you're here instead of in the council room." She held his gaze. Something moved behind her expression, not weakness, but the particular kind of honesty that only appears when someone has been seen clearly. She said, "The Korath have 3 fleet units stationed within 2 jump points of this station." Paul said, "I know." She said, "If I refuse their terms, it becomes more than diplomatic." He said, "I know that too." She said, "And your recommendation is still what you said." He said, "My recommendation is to be the kind of queen you told me you wanted to be. When you talked about truth and political weight. You already know the answer. You're just seeing if you're willing to carry it. She was silent for a long time. Then she straightened. She said, "Come to the council with me." He said he was not allowed in emergency sessions. She said, "You are now." The council room went visibly still when Paul walked in behind the queen. Vara did not pause or explain his presence. She walked to the head of the table and stood. She told the council she had reached her decision. She said she would not nullify the match result. A true outcome witnessed publicly could not be made false by decree without teaching every citizen of the sovereignty that truth had a political price. She would not accept that lesson into her governance. She said she would not restrict Paul's status. He had earned what he was given, and reducing a person's standing to satisfy external pressure was not an alliance strategy. It was submission dressed as diplomacy. She said she would respond to the Korath with a counter-proposal. The sovereignty would publicly acknowledge that the match qualification process had a gap and commit to revising the game's entry framework. That was a genuine correction worth offering. But the result would stand and Paul's status would stand. If the Korath rejected that counter-proposal and chose to withdraw from the alliance, the sovereignty would manage it. Voss said, carefully, "And the 3 Korath fleet units within 2 jump points." Vara said, "I am aware of them. I am also aware that the Korath have held this alliance for 40 years because it benefits them substantially. Their withdrawal calculus is not simple. I am choosing to believe they will calculate correctly." The room was very quiet. Then Rila, who had not spoken once during the session, said clearly and without ceremony, "I support the Queen's position." Kale, standing guard at the door and technically outside the council, said nothing but stood slightly straighter. The vote was called. 4-1 again, but the one who voted with the Queen was different this time. Voss set his notation down after a long moment and said he would support the decision he had voted against and execute it properly, because that was what he was for. The response went to the Korath through official channels before the end of the day. The 72 hours passed. Then 73. 74. On the second morning after the deadline, the Korath envoy's office sent a communication to the Sovereignty diplomatic channel. It was not the withdrawal declaration they had threatened. It was a request for a follow-up discussion. Rila brought the communication to Vara's chamber personally. She stood at the door and read it aloud, her voice holding the exact tone of a person being careful not to celebrate before it was appropriate. Vara said, "Arrange the meeting." She turned to the window and breathed out very slowly, a private breath, not for the room. Across the station in Sector 7, Paul was back on shift. He had asked Rila that morning if there was any reason he needed to remain on standby and she had said no. He had put his maintenance uniform back on, picked up his calibration kit, and gone to work on the Section 4 relay that Fun had been managing alone. Fun asked him how things had gone up in the government wing. He said complicated but all right. She handed him the pressure gauge and said he had missed a difficult week with the relay and that was more important. He agreed completely. He got to work. The Korath meeting happened 10 days later. The envoy returned in person, which was itself a signal. He met with Vara in the formal diplomatic chamber, Rila present, 2 advisors on each side, the full structure of official negotiation in place. The Koratha's position had shifted. Not surrendered, shifted. The envoy acknowledged that the ultimatum had been issued under political pressure from Draven's supporters within Korath Command and that upon reflection the core alliance terms were not worth fracturing over a game's result. The game's entry framework would be revised jointly, a working group with sovereignty and Korath representatives. Draven's overall record and reputation would be formally recognized as exceptional in a joint statement that was true and did not require erasing what had happened. Paul's name was not in the formal agreement. He was referenced once as the qualifying participant whose performance had identified the framework gap. Nothing more. Vara signed the revised agreement in the afternoon. That evening she went to Sector 7 again, alone this time except for Kale at a respectful distance. Paul was finishing his shift. She waited in the corridor, and when he came out and saw her, he did not seem surprised, just nodded in the quiet way he had. She told him the agreement was signed. She told him what it contained. He said it sounded right. Fair on both sides. She said it would not have happened the way it did if she had made the easier choice at the council. He said she had always known what to do. She had just needed a moment to be certain she was willing to. She said she was grateful for the moment. He said he was glad the Section 4 relay was finally running at correct pressure. It had been bothering him for weeks. She laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, sudden and brief and genuine. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. He thought it suited her. The status review was updated 2 weeks later. Not through the council this time. Vara had found a provision in sovereignty law that allowed the Crown to grant alliance merit designation to an individual civilian whose actions had demonstrably served the sovereignty's interests. It had been used twice before, both times for foreign diplomats. Paul's new designation was Alliance Civilian Merit, which gave him full station access, a salary adjustment, and the right to attend any non-classified council session as an observer. Voss brought him the documentation personally. He set it on the table in the transition wing and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had reviewed the station's security footage of the match 3 times since it happened. Paul waited. Voss said he still did not fully understand what he had seen. But he understood that the Queen had made good decisions under pressure and that the human in the maintenance uniform had been part of why. He said he was not a person who found it easy to revise his assessments. But he was a precise man, and precision sometimes required revision. He offered his hand. Paul shook it. Voss said he would like to understand the technique at some point, if Paul was willing. Paul said he would be willing. He said it took time to learn and the best way to start was slowly. Voss said slowly was acceptable. He left. Paul sat with the documentation for a while. He thought about the harbor city. About his father. About how strange and full life was, the way it moved like force through a body, always going somewhere, and the only real skill was learning to understand the direction and help it go there well. Fun through a small gathering in the Sector 7 break room. She said it was not a celebration because she was not sure exactly what they were celebrating, but she had made food and that seemed like enough of a reason to gather. 6 maintenance workers from various species came. A Pelori engineer named Dorn who Paul had worked beside for 18 months. A young human woman named Sarah who had arrived on station 3 months ago and was still learning the atmospheric systems. 2 Veth technicians who brought a fermented drink from their home region. Paul sat in the middle of it and ate Fun's cooking and listened to the noise of his colleagues and felt something settle in him that had been slightly unsettled since the day of the match. Sarah asked him quietly if it was true he had spoken to the Queen directly. Multiple times. He said yes. She asked what it was like. He thought about it. He said she was very direct. She listened well, which was rarer than it sounded. She asked good questions and she was not afraid of the answers. Sarah asked if she was kind. Paul thought about the moment in the corridor with the stars. About her sitting in the chair by the window that first night. About the way she had knocked on his door. He said yes. She was kind. She just carried it in a way that looked like precision from the outside. Sarah nodded and went back to her meal. Dorn, who had been listening, said Paul had managed to become the most well-known maintenance worker in sovereignty history and somehow still showed up for his shift. Paul said the relay did not fix itself. Everyone at the table found that funny. It was a good evening. 3 months after the match, Vara requested Paul's presence in the court for a formal occasion for the first time. Not as a subject being summoned. The request was worded differently. She asked if he would be willing to attend as a guest of the Crown for the annual Covenant Address, the speech she gave each year to the full court and diplomatic representatives marking the founding of the sovereignty. He came in clean clothes. Not a uniform but not formal dress either. Himself, as much as that was a thing a person could choose. The court was full. Every face Paul had come to recognize over the past months. Rila, standing straight at the Queen's right. Voss, in his general's coat, who gave Paul a small nod when he entered. Kale at the door, who grinned briefly before returning to proper guard posture. The Koroth envoy, who looked at Paul for a moment and then looked away with the dignity of someone who had arrived at a private accommodation. Vara stood at the address platform and spoke about the sovereignty, about what it was built to protect, about the tension between stability and truth that lived inside every institution and required constant, honest attention. She did not mention Paul by name. But she said this: in the past months this court was reminded that truth does not disappear because it is politically inconvenient. It reminded us that strength looks different depending on where you are standing when you observe it. It reminded us that there are things worth carrying even when they are heavy. She paused for a moment. She said, "I am grateful for that reminder." Paul stood near the back of the hall among the guests and listened and said nothing. He thought about force and direction. About weight going where it was always going anyway. About a gym that smelled like rubber mats and his father's voice saying slow is right, right is fast. When it was over and the court dispersed, Vara crossed the hall toward him. The room noticed but gave space in the way that rooms do when something important is happening at a quiet volume. She stood in front of him and said, "I wanted to ask you something." He said, "All right." She said, "What would you want, if I asked you what you wanted?" He considered it genuinely. Not performing modesty. Actually thinking. He said, "To keep doing work that matters. To be somewhere I can be honest. To feel like the place I'm in is being run by someone who actually wants to get it right." She held his gaze. She said, "I think we can manage that." He said, "Then I think I'm already where I want to be." Outside the station's long windows, the stars held still in all directions, the way they always did, patient and vast and entirely indifferent to the smallness of the things happening beneath them, which was, in the end, what made those small things so remarkable.